Hi there, I'm Mr. Arkestall, and these videos are all designed to help with knowledge of the Western Front, and that's why I'm still dressed in my Major's outfit. But this video is video 3, and it's looking at the problems with transport on the Western Front. And now I find this particularly interesting, and as when I do my battlefield tours, usually one of the things that I do is the moment you get to the other side of the channel, from the tunnel, and you start making your journey across into Belgium or France, I start talking about the idea of supply lines and how the soldiers, equipment, horses, vehicles, supplies, food would have come across from Britain to feed the soldiers. And supply lines are things that in warfare you've got to really consider, because the longer your supply lines, the further you've got to kind of transport that, and that's where you can start to get into trouble if your supplies don't keep up with the advances that you're making. It wasn't really the problem with the First World War, with the fact that a lot of it was quite stagnant, and a lot of the movement was only quite short-term phases or spaces. Anyway, today we're going to have a look at the kind of transport that was used on the Western Front and the problems, the pros and cons, I suppose, of those. This in particular is helpful when thinking about medicine, and in particular thinking about medicine on the Western Front, because one of the things you need to consider for this is how they would have treated men and what would have happened the moment a soldier was wounded, and depending on the level of wounds, how they'd be transported along that network. And that's another video that's going to be coming up, looking at the network, the transport network from stretcher bearers, regimental aid posts, all the way up to base hospitals at the far end. Today specifically we're going to look at transport. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to kick off with the trusty stretcher. Thank you. Image from IWM. This is the trusty stretcher. Notice that it's made from wood and canvas, and the idea is that it's got props underneath so that you're off the ground rather than just lying straight on the ground. It would be the first beck and call of any soldier who was wounded for a stretcher bearer or for a medic, certainly to help them in the immediacy, depending on what wound they'd got. If it was something that involved having to be carried off the battlefield, then it was something reasonably serious that had to be treated off the front line. So the stretcher to begin with was really your first point of call, and the pros are that you can immediately get a person and lift them onto the stretcher and then take them off the battlefield site. So that's the first pro, I suppose. The con really is depicted most when we have a look at this image here. This is one of my favourite images of you can have favourite images of stretchers, but this is one of my favourite images because it depicts one of the biggest issues with a stretcher. Notice how many men are having to carry that one man off the battlefield. And when you're in a serious conflict like the Battle of Passchendaele, which is where this is from, or from the Battle of the Somme, then one of the issues that you've got is how many men it's going to take one wounded man off the battlefield site. If you're taking 6 to 8 men off just for one man, and the reason being is because of the thickness of the clayey mud that you're having to lift them through, then you are going to dwindle your numbers in that fight. So that was a serious consideration in terms of the stretcher. Before we crack on and have a look at more issues, let's think about what the stretcher's got to deal with. So the stretcher bearer themselves are going to have to deal with the issues of the terrain that they're in. The moment you're outside your trench, I mean, the trench was bad enough, but once you're outside that trench and you're walking across no man's land, one of the things that you're going to come across is these huge shell holes. And artillery that's been fired constantly has decimated the area. And this is the trench map that we used in the last video. And the shell holes, you're going to really struggle to get across those. Where the stretcher bearers can come in is that, at least with a human being, you've got the ability to angle yourself and work your way around. But think about that. The pace at which you're moving is going to be quite slow. The person could be quite heavy with all the equipment that they've got on. So to lift them across a battlefield site and then walk across an area that is strewn with debris. You've got bits of shrapnel, you've got bodies themselves still, shell holes. You don't quite know how deep those shell holes are, so you've got to try and avoid them. And whilst you're carrying them, you're being shot at yourself with a machine gun or with a flamethrower, or certainly with the rifle. So you've got, first of all, terrain. The shell holes are going to cause a problem. Second of all, you've got the mud slowing you down. And thirdly, something really interesting to think about is fertilizer. These are fields. A lot of the land that we've got here, looking at the map, you've got a village, village, a lot of the stuff out here would have been fields. Therefore, as a result, fertiliser would have been used on the crops. Now, bear in mind that the artillery is going to be exploding this stuff all over the place. If you've got an open wound or a cut, then the bacteria from the fertiliser is going to get in there and give you an infection. We've got a special series of videos coming up that are going to look at treatments, but let's kind of focus that back in now with transport. So the first form of transport we've talked about are the stretchers. Second, let's kind of up the ante. The next form of transport that we're going to talk about is horse-drawn. And horses are recruited in the First World War because of the cavalry, but equally horses are being used to transport artillery, so they're pulling the big cannons up into position. Horses are also being used to transport the men off the battlefield. Here we've got a photograph of an ambulance that's being pulled by horses. Pros with this, it's going to allow you to transport more than just one man, certainly. Another pro of the horse-drawn car ambulance is that it's a little bit more sheltered and protected. Cons come from the terrain. Horses aren't going to be able to get across the muddy terrain, so therefore you've got to get them off the stretch. You've got to get them off with stretchers ideally first, but then the stretcher bearer could probably even take you to the aid post. After that, you're going to need something that's going to take you a little bit further to the next series of medical posts. And one of them is this. The cons of this is that the horses can be startled, and if the horses are shot or killed, then you've got to keep replacing your horses. Second of all, the wagons themselves aren't particularly sturdy, and therefore you're going to be rocking people around quite a lot, and as a result you could end up injuring or fracturing the wound or exacerbating the wound, making it worse. So this image really encapsulates, again, you got 2, 4, 6, potentially 6 horses pulling one ambulance, could even have 2 or 4, depending on what you need. But look at the wheels, they're already getting stuck in the mud here, and the tracks themselves are not going to be particularly serviceable. So that's your second form of transport to get people off the battlefields, and we've looked at both the pros and cons of those. Next up, we go for the motorised ambulance. This is a more modern image, but this is a motorised ambulance. Now, there weren't many motor vehicles at the time, so let's get that straight first. We're talking omnibuses in the Edwardian period, so the early 1900s, before the First World War. And an omnibus, to start with, was like a horse-drawn bus. Then eventually they replaced that with a motor. And omnibuses did make their way onto the battlefield, but it was more to transport troops around. Again, with anything that's got wheels on, it's going to be slow in the mud. It's not going to be particularly useful if it breaks down. So first of all, I suppose the pro of the motor ambulance is that, again, it's fast, possibly going to be about the same as a horse. You aren't going to lose horses with this, and you can mend the problems with the motor ambulance. However, you've got to get them there first. And by October 1914, the Times newspaper had asked the public to donate to a fund, and that fund bought 512 motorised ambulances. These ambulances were then sent over, and I think the first ones were used by November or December 1914. So it was quite quick, bearing in mind that the war's kicking off in August and the first battles are really September onwards. Your first motor ambulances are there, and the numbers will grow. The problem with the motor ambulance, again, is the terrain. Second of all, they are quite shaky. Thirdly, it's technical. If you don't have an engineer that can repair these ambulances, then once they're kaput, or once they've been shot at, or once they've been broken up, they are an expensive piece of kit that's then left. And then you've got to rely back on your horses and your wagons again. So it's worth bearing in mind this, that as you start to up the scale, then one of the issues is going to be to make sure that these vehicles are roadworthy and equally can actually make the journey from where they're being picked up, probably where the trench system is, all the way to your aid post or your base hospital eventually. So that's our third form of transport, the motor ambulance. Brilliant. We then move on to what I would call the final phase, which is how you get the more seriously wounded, those that have that need actual surgical operations, back home. The base hospital is the last point of call in a line of medical facilities and they kind of up the ante the further back you go. And it's fascinating to imagine how they put all of this into practice once they realised that this was going to be quite a stagnant war, how you were going to get your men back and forth. And the final phase is the train, the barge, and the ship. To start with, they use French goods wagons to transport the injured back to a base hospital, which is a very large hospital, as it suggests, back at base camp, usually near to the coast, because if things turn serious in there, you'd be able to get them on a ship and then across back to Britain to be treated in the hospitals there. And that's why, if you notice, it's one of the reasons why you've got Commonwealth war graves, cemeteries in Britain, because some of the wounded were brought back and died of their wounds back in this country. And so you'll find some of the graves are for that reason. Anyway, let's talk about the pros and cons. Well, first of all, one of the cons are that once you've started using trains, you're clogging up the train network with wounded men rather than using it to bring supplies and goods and the fit soldiers up to the front. It's one issue with the transporting of soldiers is that. And here's an image of a fairly organised looking train that was converted to have these beds. So you can notice that you've got nurses here, various different degrees of women on the Western Front helping. There were nurses and there were first aid nursing yeomanry, which we'll talk about in another video. And they were part of the medical corps that came to help the wounded and the medical needs of soldiers in the First World War. So here we can see the insides of one of these trains, and you can see that they are equipped to take a large number of people. So one thing with the trains, they can cater for a large number of wounded and more serious wounded. They're very stable, so they won't rock around too much. The cons are that they're blocking up the transport system. Another con is that if you knock out the train system, either by artillery or air attack, then the trains aren't going anywhere, and so you've got a large number of men that can't actually move. But they were quite reliable, and on the whole, a good way of being able to move the wounded quite quickly. Next up then, because they wanted to move away from using the train network, they decided to try and use the canals. So we've got the barge, which is an interesting one. With the barge, what you've got here is the stretcher look, loading the barge up. These barges were quite large, and inside you could again cater for quite a lot of wounded. They'd also have their own medical team on board. So the pros, you've got large numbers that can be put on these barges. Another pro, they can be quite smooth and quite direct. A lot of the canals were quite close to where some of the fighting was taking place. But that equally is a con, because if the canals are drained, or if the canals are taken by the enemy, then you can't use them. So you've got to have access to water to be able to use these things. They're equally very slow. So not as fast as the train network. The barges themselves would be a slower way of moving soldiers from the front line back to base hospitals. And finally, we come then to the ship. The medical ship, you'll have seen these being used in war films, I suppose. But with the medical ship, here what you've got is a Red Cross to denote that it's a medical one. And you would transport, again, large numbers. By this point, you are way past where the front line and where the danger is. I suppose you've got the naval problem, but in the First World War, there weren't the issues that we had in the Second World War of huge numbers of U-boats attacking medical transports, but it's still a problem, as were mines. The great thing about medical ships is that these were usually for the most seriously wounded, and they could bring you across from France over to Britain to be treated. Facilities are on board. The only cons, I suppose, with the medical ship is that it could be sunk, but mildly. Mostly the pros of, and also a con by that point is the only direction you're going to is back to Britain, to Blighty, to get treated. So I suppose you've got to factor that in. All in all, the transport network that was used on the Western Front eventually became quite comprehensive. Once we got the introduction of these little mini train lines, they could be used for bringing up equipment and supplies, freeing up the trains themselves. But imagine the shelling, and imagine access to a train station as well. You've got to have the train line ready. And that was one of the issues, that the train line could be occupied or taken by the enemy. Anyway, that is a rundown of all the kind of major transport that was being used on the Western Front, and hopefully that will be useful for you. Thank you for listening. Take care.